"This is my property, and that is my boat," I yelled over the roar of her engine. She was 100 feet away, perched on her garish, canary-yellow jet ski like a furious hornet. "You are trespassing on community property," she shrieked, her voice cutting across the water. "And you need to get rid of those vicious beasts before they hurt someone." She pointed a trembling manicured finger towards my dock, where my two cane corsos, Caesar and Brutus, stood rigid, their low growls a testament to their training and their displeasure. This was Brenda, president of the HOA, self-appointed queen of a kingdom that didn't include me. She gunned the engine of her jet ski, aiming it like a battering ram. What she did next was so insane, so unbelievable. It changed everything. Ever dealt with a neighbor who thinks they own the entire world, including your little slice of it? Let me know where you're watching from, because this story gets absolutely crazy. It all began 6 months earlier when I bought my version of paradise. For 20 years, I'd worked as a civil engineer, specializing in hydrology, the science of water, how it moves, and where it goes. My career had taken me to arid deserts, to design irrigation systems, and to floodplains, to design resilient levees. I'd spent my life managing water for others, and my one dream was to have a piece of it all to myself. I found it in a 20-acre plot on the far edge of a new upscale development called Willow Creek Estates. The property was a holdout, a parcel of land that had been owned by the same family for a century before being sold to me. The main feature, the jewel that made me sign the papers without a second thought, was a 5-acre, crystal-clear, spring-fed lake. The house was a modest ranch, but the land, the lake, that was the treasure. Before closing, I spent a week in the county records office, pulling every plat, survey, and deed associated with my parcel and the surrounding development. My engineering background made me pathologically meticulous. The records were unequivocal. My 20 acres, including the lake in its entirety, were carved out and recorded a full decade before Willow Creek Estates was even a blueprint. I was not, and could never be, part of their homeowners association. It was a sovereign island of tranquility, next to an ocean of beige houses and manicured lawns. My first interaction with Brenda happened the day I was moving in. A gleaming white Lexus SUV pulled into my long gravel driveway, crunching to a halt with an air of importance. A woman emerged, dressed in tennis whites that looked like they'd never seen at court, her blonde hair sprayed into a helmet of immobility. "I'm Brenda," she announced, not so much introducing herself as presenting herself. "President of the Willow Creek OA. Just wanted to drop off our welcome packet and a copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She held out a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. I wiped the sweat from my brow and smiled politely. "I appreciate the welcome, but my property isn't actually in your HOA. A flicker of something disbelief, annoyance, maybe both crossed her face. It was as if I'd told her the sky was green. "Of course it is," she said with a dismissive little laugh. "We're all Willow Creek here." I was too tired to argue. "I can assure you it's not. I've got the surveys and the deed right here in the house if you'd like to see them." Her smile tightened. "Well," she sniffed, "I'm sure we'll get that all sorted out. The rules are for everyone's benefit, you know. To maintain property values." She left the binder on my porch railing and drove off. I used it that night to help start a fire in my new fire pit. It felt symbolic. A week later, the first official-looking envelope arrived. It was a violation notice. My fence rustic split-rail fence that had been on the property for 30 years was not of an approved material or color. I wrote a polite registered letter back, enclosing a copy of my property survey and a single sentence explaining that the HOA had no jurisdiction. Her response was another letter, this time about my dogs. Caesar and Brutus were my companions and my security. 2 massive cane corsos, with heads like anvils and chests like barrels. To me, they were 130-pound puppies. To an outsider, I understood they could be intimidating. They were also impeccably trained. The letter from Brenda declared them an unapproved aggressive breed and a neighborhood nuisance. I responded again, registered mail, same message, not your jurisdiction. I started to understand that Brenda didn't operate on the basis of facts or laws. She operated on the basis of her own perceived authority. She saw my property, my beautiful lake, not as my private retreat, but as a gap in her perfect, orderly world, a rogue state that needed to be brought under her control. The dream, for me, wasn't just the lake itself. It was what the lake represented. It was freedom. And for years, that freedom had a very specific image in my mind. A classic wooden boat, gliding across the water at sunset. After months of searching, I found it. A 1964 Chris Craft sea skiff, 22 feet of varnished mahogany and polished chrome. It was a piece of art, a floating piece of history that I'd had restored to pristine, museum-quality condition. The day it was delivered was one of the happiest of my adult life. I spent the morning waxing the hull until it shone like glass. The plan was simple: back the trailer down my private boat ramp, float my dream into my own private lake, and enjoy the silence. And that's when Brenda chose to declare war. I had just unhooked the winch. The boat was floating free, tethered to the dock by a single rope. That's when I heard the high-pitched whine. It was Brenda on her jet ski, coming in hot from the other side of the lake, where the HOA's property began. My lake was shaped like a kidney bean, with the vast majority of it, including all access points, on my land. A tiny sliver, maybe a quarter of an acre of water, technically lapped up against the HOA's community green space. It was from this sliver that she launched her assault. She was a yellow blur against the blue water, creating a wake that slapped against my new dock. Then she started screaming her nonsense about community property and my vicious beasts. I stood there, dumbfounded by the sheer audacity. She wasn't just buzzing me, she was circling, getting closer with each pass, her face contorted with rage. I think she meant to pull up alongside and lecture me, to assert her dominance. But Brenda, for all her bluster, was not a skilled operator. She misjudged her speed, her turn, everything. Instead of gliding to a stop, she plowed her jet ski directly into the side of my Chris Craft. The sound was sickening. Not a clang, but a wet, splintering crack. The sound of history and beauty being violated by cheap fiberglass and pure entitlement. The impact sent a shudder through the wooden hull. My dream boat now had a gaping, ugly hole in its port side. Caesar and Brutus erupted, their barks echoing across the water, straining against the confines of the dock. Brenda was thrown from her machine, splashing into the water. She came up sputtering, screaming, not in pain, but in pure, unadulterated fury. "Look what you made me do. You and your stupid boat, you're going to pay for this?" In that moment, watching the water seep into the wound in my boat, a cold, calm resolve settled over me. Brenda had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought I was just some guy with a boat. She was about to find out what a hydrologist with a grudge and unlimited patience could do. She hadn't just crashed into my boat, she had crashed into my life's work, and I was about to make her pay for the damages with interest. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, as Brenda thrashed in the water screaming threats and accusations, a strange calm washed over me. The initial shock and rage at seeing my beautiful Chris Craft brutalized morphed into something colder, more focused. My professional life had been about managing chaotic systems, finding order in turmoil, and I instinctively fell back on that training. While she was accusing my stationary docked boat of assault, I pulled out my phone and hit record. Her tirade was a symphony of misplaced blame and shrieking entitlement, all dutifully captured in 1080p. "I'm calling the police!" she sputtered, trying to haul herself back onto her damaged jet ski. "I'm calling animal control on these monsters. They'll be put down." "Please do," I said, my voice unnervingly level. "Tell them to meet you at my property line. You're trespassing." 2 sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later. They found a scene of contrasts. Brenda, dripping wet and apoplectic, was practically vibrating with fury. I was standing calmly on my dock, phone still in hand, next to my wounded boat. My dogs, now silent at my command, sat like stoic, furry gargoyles. I let Brenda tell her story first. It was a work of fiction, a wild tale of my uncontrolled boat lunging out and hitting her while she was patrolling the community lake, and how my attack dogs had tried to maul her. When she finally ran out of breath, one of the deputies turned to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply presented the facts. I showed them my phone with my address clearly visible on the screen. I walked them to the property marker, a large iron pin set in concrete by the original surveyors, clearly delineating the start of my land, well back from the lake shore. I presented them with the folded survey map I now kept in my back pocket. I explained that she had crossed onto my private lake, on my private land, and had crashed into my legally docked boat. The deputies exchanged a look. They had dealt with HOAs before. "Ma'am," the senior deputy said to Brenda, his voice heavy with weary patience, "this is a civil matter, but you are currently on private property. We need you to leave." "This is HO water," she insisted. "Sir," the deputy said, turning back to me, ignoring her, "if she doesn't leave, you can have her charged with trespassing." Brenda's face went from red to a sort of pale purple. She shot me a look of pure hatred, started her sputtering jet ski, and sped away, leaving a final threat hanging in the air. "The HOA will sue you into the Stone Age." This was a small victory, but it felt good. It also confirmed my suspicion. Brenda was not going to stop. She was going to escalate. The war had officially begun. The next day, a boat surveyor confirmed my fears. The damage to the Chris craft was severe. The impact had cracked not just the mahogany planking but 2 of the structural ribs beneath. Repairing it wouldn't be simple woodwork. It would be more like marine reconstructive surgery. The estimate came back at just over $28,000. That evening, the first formal salvo from the HOA arrived via courier. It was a package of smugly printed documents. There was a fine for unauthorized and unapproved watercraft on a community amenity, a fine for maintaining animals of a restricted breed, a fine for creating a hazardous wake, which was poetically ironic, and the pièce de résistance, a bill for $2,000 to repair the fiberglass on her jet ski. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was almost impressive. They were billing me for the bullet she had used to shoot me. It was then I realized that my simple, factual letters were like firing spitballs at a tank. I needed bigger guns. My first call was to a man named David Chen, a lawyer whose reputation preceded him. He was known as the HOA Slayer. He was a quiet, unassuming man in person, but in a courtroom, he was a predator. I laid out the entire story in his office, providing him with my binder of deeds, surveys, and the violation notices. He listened intently, peering at the documents through his reading glasses. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Your position on the property is legally unassailable," he said. "You could win this easily. But winning and making it stop are 2 different things. An HOA like this, led by a person like that," he tapped Brenda's name on the letterhead, "they run on emotion and ego, not logic. They will use the members' money to harass you until you either give in or run out of money yourself. Reacting to them isn't enough. We need to go on the offensive. We need to dismantle their entire power structure." I liked the way he thought. My new mission wasn't just to get my boat fixed. It was to liberate Willow Creek Estates. My next step was to turn my property into a fortress of evidence. I spared no expense. I had a commercial-grade security system installed. Not just a doorbell camera, but a network of 16 high-definition 4K cameras with powerful zoom lenses and night vision. They covered every inch of my property line, every angle of the lake, the dock, and the driveway. Most importantly, I ensured the system had high-fidelity audio recording capabilities. I checked, and our state was a one-party consent state for recording conversations on your own property. Every scream, every threat, every future trespass would be captured in glorious, undeniable detail. With the legal and physical defenses in place, I moved on to the offensive. David had said we needed to dismantle their power structure, and I knew from my engineering work that to understand any structure, you have to study its foundation. I started my deep dive into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. My specialty is hydrology, and my first question was about their lake. Brenda kept calling it a community amenity, but on the original development plans I pulled from the county, it was labeled Stormwater Retention Pond 1. It was a functional piece of infrastructure, disguised as a luxury. Its primary purpose wasn't for residents to enjoy a water view. It was to prevent the entire neighborhood from flooding during a heavy rain by collecting runoff from streets and yards. My lake was spring-fed, a living body of water. Hers was a glorified drainage ditch. The distinction was critical. Then I started looking at the HOA's publicly available records, specifically their budgets and contracts. Something immediately smelled wrong. The line item for landscape and grounds maintenance was gargantuan, nearly half of their entire annual budget. The designated contractor was a company I'd never heard of. It took me less than 5 minutes on the state's business registry website to find out why. The company, Pristine Lawns LLC, was registered to a Mr. Frank Miller. It took one more search on social media to find a photo of Brenda at a family barbecue, her arms slung around Frank Miller, with the caption, "Love my amazing brother-in-law." She was funneling HOA dues directly into her own family's pockets. The pieces were starting to click into place. Brenda wasn't just a power-hungry control freak, she was a crook. And her little kingdom was built on a foundation of lies and embezzlement. I had her for the boat. Now, I was going to have her for everything else. To truly dismantle Brenda's regime, I needed more than public records. I needed intelligence from within the walls of her kingdom. I needed an ally. My search for a confederate began subtly. I started taking my afternoon walks, not on my own sprawling property, but along the sidewalk that bordered the HOA. Just on the other side of my fence line, Caesar and Brutus trotted dutifully at my side. At first, the residents I passed would offer a tight, nervous smile and hurry along, no doubt having been warned about the rogue neighbor and his vicious beasts. Brenda's propaganda machine had been effective, but I was patient. I was looking for a specific type of person, someone whose garden was just a little too perfect, whose lawn edges were razor sharp, but who had a look of quiet resignation in their eyes. The look of someone fighting a losing battle against oppressive mediocrity. I found him 3 houses down. His name was George, a retired CPA in his late 60s, with a kind face and hands that were perpetually stained with a little bit of soil. His crime, as I would later learn, was installing a tasteful dark bronze bird bath. It was, according to a notice he'd received from Brenda, a non-conforming lawn ornament of an unapproved hue. We struck up a conversation over his fence one afternoon. I started by complimenting his prize-winning roses. He was wary at first, but when he saw that my vicious beasts were more interested in sniffing his hydrangeas than in any nefarious activities, he opened up. I told him a little about my situation, framing it as a simple property line dispute. George just shook his head slowly. "Son," he said, "it's not about the lines on a map. It's about her. This HOA isn't a community, it's her personal fiefdom. We're all just serfs paying taxes." That was my opening. George, it turned out, had been on the HOA's finance committee for a year before quitting in disgust. He still had friends who were on it, and as a homeowner, he had the right to request the detailed financial statements. He was terrified of Brenda's retribution, but the story of her crashing into my boat and then trying to bill me for it seemed to ignite a spark of rebellion in him. He agreed to help. 2 days later, a thick manila envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was 5 years of Willow Creek HOA's financial records, meeting minutes, and approved vendor lists. For the next week, I barely slept. My dining room table became a command center, covered in spreadsheets and printouts. With my engineer's eye for systems and George's guidance on accounting practices, I began to unravel Brenda's web of deceit. It was even more rotten than I had imagined. The landscaping contract with her brother-in-law was just the beginning. I found a recurring monthly payment, listed under aquatic maintenance, to a company called Clear Water Solutions. They were supposedly providing aeration and chemical treatments for the retention pond Brenda's lake. The payments were substantial, totaling over $30,000 a year. A quick search revealed that Clear Water Solutions had been officially dissolved by the state 2 years prior for failure to pay taxes. The address listed on their old invoices was a mailboxes, etc. The money was being paid to a ghost company. It was vanishing into thin air, and I had a strong suspicion I knew whose pocket it was landing in. But the real smoking gun, the discovery that would become the centerpiece of my entire strategy, came from the meeting minutes. 3 months ago, Brenda and her hand-picked board had railroaded through a special assessment. Every single one of the 200 homeowners in Willow Creek was being forced to pay an extra $1,500. The stated purpose? Urgent, critical repairs to the North Dam. This is where Brenda's ignorance became my greatest weapon. She didn't know my background. She didn't know I'd spent a decade of my life designing, inspecting, and reinforcing dams and water control structures. The term urgent, critical repairs set off alarm bells in my head. Real dam trouble is catastrophic. It's not something you fund with an HOA assessment. Over the next few days, I conducted my own professional, albeit unofficial, structural assessment. Using publicly available topographic maps from the USGS, satellite imagery, and the original developer's grading plans, I created a complete hydrological and structural model of their retention pond system. I then did some on-the-ground reconnaissance from public property. The dam she was talking about was nothing more than a simple earthen berm with a concrete weir and a low-flow spillway pipea standard, boilerplate design for a stormwater pond of this size. I took dozens of high-resolution photos with a telephoto lens. There were no signs of seepage, no slumping of the earthworks, no cracking in the concrete weir. The structure was perfectly sound and functioning exactly as designed. The $1,500 assessment for urgent repairs was a complete and utter fabrication. It was fraud, plain and simple. She was using scare tactics, leveraging the homeowner's ignorance about engineering to fleece them out of a collective $300,000. I now had a formidable arsenal. With George's help, I began to assemble it into a comprehensive dossier. It included my property surveys and deeds, proving my independence. It had the insane repair estimate for my Chris Craft. It had the evidence of the inflated landscaping contract with her brother-in-law, complete with a family tree I'd sketched out based on social media. It contained proof that the HOA was making payments to a defunct company. And at the heart of it all was my own sworn, notarized engineering report, complete with photographs, diagrams, and a professional opinion stating that the urgent dam repairs were entirely fraudulent. I even found 2 other neighbors, emboldened by my quiet investigation, who were willing to sign affidavits about Brenda's bullying tactics over nonsense like the placement of a basketball hoop and the color of their front door. The case was no longer about my boat. It was about liberating an entire community from a petty dictator who was stealing from them in plain sight. My revenge wouldn't just be getting a check for the damages. My revenge would be her public, undeniable, and complete humiliation. The first move in the final phase of the operation was made by my lawyer, David. He drafted and sent a formal demand letter to Brenda, addressed to her personally, and CC'd to the HOA's board. The letter was a masterpiece of legal prose, politely but firmly demanding payment in full for the $28,000 in damages to my boat, citing her negligence and trespass. As we fully expected, the response came not from Brenda, but from the HOA's law firm. It was a comically aggressive letter, flatly denying any responsibility. It claimed I had created a navigational hazard, and that my boat's the wake of a docked vessel had caused Brenda to lose control. It ended with a formal counterclaim, on behalf of the HOA, demanding I immediately cease and desist my use of the community lake and pay for the damage to her jet ski. It was a declaration of war, and it was the single biggest mistake they could have made. By responding through the HOA's legal counsel and issuing a counterclaim in the HOA's name, they had officially and irrevocably linked Brenda's personal, reckless actions to the entire homeowners association. She was no longer just a rogue agent. She was acting with the full documented authority of the board. This was exactly the legal entanglement David had hoped for. She had taken the bait. The perfect venue for my counteroffensive was already on the calendar. The Willow Creek Estates annual homeowners meeting. George confirmed my intelligence. Brenda had put herself on the agenda to lead a special presentation. The topic was the ongoing security and liability issues posed by the adjacent, non-compliant property, which was a flowery way of saying me. She planned to use the specter of my frivolous lawsuit and my illegal use of her lake to justify the special assessment for the dam repairs and to demand an even larger legal defense fund. She was going to use me as the boogeyman to scare the homeowners into giving her a blank check. She was building her own gallows, and I was more than happy to provide the rope. A week before the meeting, I deployed my next piece of psychological bait. I hired a prominent geotechnical engineering firm, the kind of company that does soil borings for skyscrapers and stability analysis for major dams. I made sure their truck, emblazoned with a massive logo reading Hydro-Geo Surveys Inc., was parked conspicuously at the end of my driveway for 2 full days. Their team, armed with sophisticated-looking equipment, took water samples, planted small flags, and consulted impressive-looking blueprints all around my lakefront, in full view of the street. It was all for show. The real, substantive report was already done by me, but the visual of the big, expensive engineering firm sent Brenda into a paranoid spiral. My security cameras captured her driving by slowly, over and over, frantically taking pictures with her phone and making agitated calls. She assumed I was building my case for the lawsuit, and I was. But the case I was building wasn't for a judge. It was for a jury of her peers, the very people she was swindling. The night of the meeting arrived. The clubhouse community room was packed, stuffy, and buzzing with a nervous energy. I saw George give me a subtle, encouraging nod from across the room. I took a seat in the back, my lawyer David beside me, a laptop bag containing my entire arsenal resting at my feet. Brenda stood at the podium, flanked by her 2 pet board members, a milquetoast man who never made eye contact and a woman who mirrored Brenda's smug expression. Brenda was in her element, basking in the spotlight. She launched into her pre-packaged PowerPoint. There it was, on a 10-foot screen, a telephoto shot of my house, a picture of my boat, a grainy, blown-up picture of Caesar, mid-bark, made to look as terrifying as possible. She spoke in grave, serious tones about respecting community assets, the sanctity of our bylaws, and the threats from outside. She painted me as a rich, arrogant interloper trying to steal their resources. Then came the finale, a slide with a big, red, ominous heading. Urgent Dam Infrastructure Project. She told the assembled homeowners that due to my reckless behavior and the new stresses on the waterway, the North Dam was now at a critical failure point. The 300-0 special assessment was not just necessary, it was an emergency. The room was somber. She had them. They were beaten down, ready to write the checks, just to make the problem go away. Then came the period for homeowner comments. I stood up. A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "You are not a member of this association," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You have no standing here. Sit down." "Actually, he does," David said, rising smoothly to his feet. His calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Since your board has seen fit to make my client, Mr. Evans, the primary subject of this meeting, and since you are proposing a significant financial assessment directly predicated on his alleged actions under state law, he absolutely has the right to be heard." George stood up. "I want to hear what he has to say." Then another man in the front row stood up. "So do I." Suddenly, a dozen people were calling for me to be allowed to speak. Brenda was trapped. Denying me now would look like she had something to hide. "Fine," she snapped, a venomous smile on her face. 5 minutes. But we have a projector ready if you'd like to show us all your big, fancy, illegal boat." "Thank you," I said. "I brought my own." I walked to the front, plugged my laptop into their projector, and the screen flickered to life. My first slide wasn't a picture of a boat. It was a high-resolution image of my official, county-stamped property deed, with the boundaries of my 20 acres highlighted in bright yellow. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified by the microphone. "My name is Michael Evans. Contrary to what you've just been told, I am not your enemy. In fact, I believe we have a common enemy." Click. The next slide showed my engineering credentials and a brief bio. I'm a civil engineer. I specialize in hydrology and structural integrity. For the past week, I've taken the liberty of doing a professional analysis of the very issues we're discussing tonight. Click. Slide 3. A detailed satellite overlay map showing my spring-fed lake and the HOA's stormwater retention pond. A bright blue line showed the underground spring that fed my lake. A series of red arrows showed the storm drains and gutters from all their streets feeding into theirs. These are two separate bodies of water. Mine is natural. Yours is a man-made piece of the storm drainage system. They have never been connected. Click. Slide 4. My engineering report on the dam, complete with close-up photos of the perfectly intact weir and spillway. The conclusion, in large, bold font: structure is 100% sound. No repairs required. Gasps rippled through the room. Click. Slide 5. A simple comparison chart. On one side, the annual cost of the HOA's landscaping contract. On the other, quotes for the exact same services from 3 other top-rated local firms. The difference was over $80,000 a year. I was curious about this discrepancy, I said innocently. Click. The next slide showed the business registration for Pristine Lawns LLC. Owner, Frank Miller. Next to it, a folksy family photo from Brenda's Facebook page. Brenda with her hubby and her amazing brother-in-law, Frank. The room erupted in murmurs. Click. The next slide showed a screenshot of the state website listing Clear Water Solutions as dissolved. Next to it was a copy of a cashed check from the HOA to that company, dated last month. "You've paid over $60,000 in the last 2 years to a company that doesn't exist." Brenda was no longer smug. She was sheet white, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The mood in the room had done a 180-degree turn. The hostility was no longer directed at me. It was a laser beam pointed directly at the woman at the podium. I had one more card to play: the kill shot. The room was electric, with a mixture of shock and simmering rage. Brenda, who just moments before had been the picture of regal authority, now looked like a cornered animal. She was sputtering, trying to form words, grabbing the microphone. "Lies. These are all lies. Forged documents. He's trying to divide us." Her 2 board members looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. I held up a hand for silence. "Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic denials. "You're right. Maybe this is all just paperwork. Maybe we should look at something a little more visual. Since you seem so convinced that my private lake is actually community property, perhaps you can narrate this video for us." I hit the play button. The screen flickered, and suddenly everyone was looking at a crystal-clear 4K video from my new security system. It was the view from my dock, looking out over the water. The sound was impeccable. We all heard the high-pitched whine of an approaching jet ski. Then Brenda's voice, shrill and clear as a bell, echoed through the community center. "This is OR Lake. I'm the president. This is community property." Then, the sickening, splintering crack as her yellow jet ski plowed into the side of my mahogany boat. The video was damning. The violence of the impact, her aggressive approach, her own words convicting Harriet, left no room for doubt. A collective gasp went through the room. I let the video play for a few more seconds, capturing her screaming blame at my stationary boat, before I paused it. But I wasn't done. Trespassing and property destruction are serious, of course, I continued, my eyes locked on hers. But it speaks to a pattern of behavior. For instance, here's some footage from 3 nights ago. Click. A new video played. This one was night vision, green and ethereal. It showed a figure sneaking onto my property, down to my dock. The figure was unmistakably Brenda. She was trying to unscrew the bulbs from my new solar-powered dock lights. Someone in the audience yelled, "Oh my God!" Brenda just stared at the screen, her face a mask of horror. Click! One final video. This one was aimed at George's house. The audio captured Brenda, red-faced and screaming, shaking her finger at George. The subject of her tirade? A bird bath. "This is an abomination. An unapproved hue. You will remove it, or I will have it removed." The quiet gentleman she was berating was sitting right there in the third row. The entire room turned to look at George, then back at the shrieking harpy on the screen. The humiliation was absolute. It was public. It was total. As the image of Brenda screaming about a bird bath faded to black, my lawyer, David, stood up. He walked calmly to the podium, placing a hand on my shoulder. "My client has presented his evidence," David said in a measured, powerful voice. "And while it is certainly compelling, we believe this is no longer just an internal HOA matter." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "As of this morning, copies of Mr. Evans' entire dossier, including his certified engineering report, the full financial analysis, and sworn affidavits from multiple residents, were delivered by courier to the State Attorney General's office, the Internal Revenue Service, and the District Attorney for this county. They will be investigating the HOA for potential wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." A wave of shock silenced the room. Brenda swayed on her feet. Her enablers on the board looked physically ill. Furthermore, David continued, his voice hardening, "We will be filing a formal complaint with the state to have this entire board removed for gross negligence and breach of their fiduciary duty. For the residents here tonight, I have some simple advice. Do not pay the fraudulent special assessment. Any attempt by this board to place a lien on your property for non-payment will be met with an immediate and very robust class action lawsuit." It was like a dam had broken. The fear that had held the community silent for years washed away in a tidal wave of anger. People were on their feet, shouting questions, yelling at Brenda. George, his face grim but resolute, stood up and formally made a motion for a vote of no confidence in Brenda and the entire board. The ayes were a deafening roar. There wasn't a single nay. An emergency interim board was nominated and elected on the spot. The new president, by unanimous consent, was George. Under the furious glares of 200 of her neighbors, Brenda and her two cronies gathered their things and slunk toward the exit. It wasn't a walk of shame. It was a crawl. As they pushed open the doors to the parking lot, they were met by the two sheriff's deputies I had seen at my lake. David had called them ahead of time, suggesting their presence might be required to keep the peace. They didn't arrest her then and there, but their quiet, serious conversation with her on the steps of the clubhouse was a fitting end to her reign. The fallout was swift and spectacular. Brenda and her husband put their house on the market a week later and were gone within a month. The State Attorney General's investigation, buoyed by the mountain of evidence I had provided, resulted in criminal indictments. Brenda was charged with felony embezzlement for the ghost company and the landscaping kickbacks. She pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, was sentenced to 2 years of probation, and was forced to pay nearly $250,000 in restitution back to the HOA. My civil suit against her was settled so fast it made my head spin. Her homeowner's insurance, not wanting any part of a trial where my evidence would be shown, wrote a check for the full $28,000 to restore my boat, plus an additional $10,000 for the diminution of its value. Under George's calm and honest leadership, the Willow Creek HOA was reborn. The corrupt contracts were shredded, a forensic audit was performed, and transparent financial controls were put in place. The thick book of ridiculous petty rules was pared down to a single page of common-sense guidelines. For the first time, it actually felt like a community. The new board even sent me a formal, written apology and passed a new bylaw that explicitly recognized the sovereignty of my property, ensuring a fight like this could never happen again. 6 months later, I was back where I belonged. The Chris craft, restored to perfection by a master artisan, gleamed under the summer sun, not a scar on her. I throttled down, the engine humming a quiet, contented tune as the boat glided across the glassy surface of my lake. Caesar and Brutus were snoozing on the dock, their peaceful snorts carrying over the water. The whole ordeal had been a descent into a suburban heart of darkness, a battle against an enemy fueled by ego and entitlement. But in the end, it wasn't just about my boat, my dogs, or my land. It was about proving that a bully is only as strong as the fear they create. When you stand up, when you bring the facts to light, their entire pathetic kingdom crumbles. And that victory, that sweet, quiet vindication, feels almost as good as the sun on your face and the gentle rocking of a perfectly balanced boat on your own private water. I learned that sometimes the most effective way to deal with a chaotic system isn't to contain it, it's to dismantle it, piece by fraudulent piece.